Thank you for coming out. My name is Brenna Simmons St. Ange, and I work here at the Alliance for Sustainable Colorado, and it's my honor to start the evening. The Alliance for Sustainable Colorado's mission is to transform sustainability from vision to reality. In essence, we make sustainability happen across the Front Range. But that's a really big statement. That's a big mission. So you might be asking yourself, how do we do that? We serve our mission in a number of different ways, and one of those ways is actually through this building. The top 4 floors of this building are a shared office workspace, and there's about 250 individuals that represent 50 organizations that come here. Thanks, Danny. That come here every day to collaborate and to increase the quality of life for Coloradans. We also service our mission through this building with events, opening our doors to folks like yourselves and welcoming our community to talk about very vital issues that are crucial to sustainability and advancing the sustainability agenda in Colorado. Another way that we use the building is through a direct current migration project that we're working on. So we have created this building to be a learning, living laboratory, an incubator for innovation, if you will. And one of the keystone projects we're working on right now is creating a microgrid out of this building and wiring it with direct current, where we would have solar panels on the roof, battery packs in the basement, and we would actually be run on direct current, where most of the other, if not all, the energy that you're used to using runs on alternating current. So that's a really paradigm-shifting project that we're working on right now. And the really exciting part of that project is actually the replication model, and how do we scale that work and teach the lessons learned to other built environments. Another way that we service our mission, and the last thing I'll speak to about that this evening, is through our clean energy campaign. We're actually commissioning a feasibility study right now to look at what it would take to aggressively scale up renewables across the state. And the impact of that would be extreme reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Key to all of our programs is collaboration, right? We couldn't do what we do without the people that we work with and the organizations that we partner with to achieve this broad mission. And the Truth in Media Coalition, who helped put on this event tonight, is a perfect example of that. We've partnered with, and excuse me if I run out of breath on this one, Common Cause, Democracy Now!, KGNU, the Internet Archive, Colorado Independent, Free Speech TV, the Sierra Club, Conservation Colorado, Denver Open Media, Cross-Pollinating Solutions, and this list keeps growing by the week. These groups have come together to help encourage Coloradans to recognize the importance of media in our lives, from what gets covered on the nightly news, to policies and elections, to climate change. But you might be asking yourself, if our mission is to, in essence, make sustainability happen, why are we focusing on media? Well, imagine for me, in your mind, in your mind's eye, the World Wide Web of life, where everything is connected to everything else. From healthcare to education, to policy and transportation, to the built environment, to agriculture and land use and food, to climate change, and yes, to media. Media tells our stories. Media shapes the American culture. Journalists, editors, and reporters are the modern-day myth makers. They're creating the legends, the heroes, and the villains that will live on into the next generations. And this is especially poignant in a presidential election year. The Paris Accord that was signed last December is a monumental agreement. And the Clean Power Plan has the ability to impact real change in how Americans get and interact with their energy. Both of those are on the whim of the next president. I actually read an article yesterday in the Huffington Post that said that only 6% of Americans have, and I quote, a great deal of confidence in the press. And you know, this number doesn't surprise me, it really doesn't. If you look to 2015, major broadcast media and Sunday morning talk shows gave more attention, guess what, to climate denial than they did to climate change. While we all experienced the hottest year on record, and CO2 emissions were on the greatest rise since record keeping began. There's something wrong with that. That just doesn't compute, right? Am I the only one that thinks that? No, 94% of Americans agree with that. We cannot sit idly by and let corporate media bias the messages and filter the information that shapes our modern American culture. That's why we formed the Truth in Media Coalition, to not only increase media literacy across Colorado, but to raise awareness about independent and nonprofit media. Tonight, we have the honor of hearing from one of our heroes from the Truth in Media Coalition, Ms. Amy Goodman. Tonight, after you hear her speak, there'll be an opportunity for a book signing with her and her co-author, Mr. Dennis Moynihan. Like I said earlier, Tattered Cover is in the back here selling books, so if you didn't get one, you did not miss that opportunity. And here to introduce Amy Goodman is her co-author, Mr. Dennis Moynihan, of their new book, 20 Years Covering the Movements Changing America. Dennis Moynihan.
Thanks to everyone, all of you here for coming out tonight. As Brenna said, I'm Dennis Moynihan. I work with Democracy Now! And I've done so since about the year 2000 in different capacities with a few odd little mini sabbaticals thrown in, but it's been a real honor and inspiration for me to work with Amy Goodman and the crew at Democracy Now! I'm also doubly blessed because I get to live here in Denver, and since 2008 I've been essentially working from home and traveling with Amy and the crew when we do remote broadcasts, and we've been covering, among other things, the global struggle to confront climate change, I guess I'd call it. You know, one of the things we do is go to the UN climate summits, which happen annually. And since 2009, where there was a very big one for which many had high hopes in Copenhagen, until most recently in Paris. And we've done our best not only to cover the minutiae, the complexities of that effort, but also the incredible gathering and of civil society that happens outside the secure walls of these summits. And that's really so important to understand. And what the title of the book, Democracy Now! 20 Years Covering the Movements Changing America, aspires to contain is that description. What Democracy Now! Covers is not just the daily news, and certainly not the news as it's been commodified and frankly perverted by some of the corporate networks, but what people are doing on a daily basis around the world, in our communities, to try to make the world a better place. And it happens, these struggles happen everywhere, and I was instructed about that really in a very moving way. Well, first, I mean, it was when I first heard Democracy Now! 20 years ago, in the summer of '96, I guess you could say I was trying to live sustainably. I was living off the coast of Maine as a caretaker on an off-the-grid island. I commuted 6 miles to shore in a sea kayak when I needed groceries or human contact. And there was another there was a little more connected island about 4 miles away where I could access a payphone. So it was pretty nice, idyllic, and very low-paying gig caretaking that island. It was the island owned by the family of Buckminster Fuller years after he had died, but his family was still there, and several of the domes that he had experimented with early on. So it was a nice place. But it was important that I had access to a community radio station called WERU in Blue Hill, Maine. And it was that summer that I first heard Democracy Now!, the first summer that the show aired. A few years later, I was part of an organizing collaborative for a direct action to protest the World Trade Organization in Seattle. That protest sought to block the meeting and to educate the public about what the World Trade Organization was and what corporate-controlled globalization sought to do, because it was kind of a sector of global corporate control that had very little publicity, and it was very hard to understand, and a mass movement was growing to help confront that. And that protest in Seattle in November, early December of 1999 was a signal moment in the shift. It was important for the organizing. We had about 1,000 people ultimately directly involved in the direct action that blocked streets, blocked buses from getting to the convention center. This happened, if you know the scenario, in the milieu of an unrestrained police riot. A lot of police violence, tear gas, flashbang grenades, rubber-coated steel balls being fired at nonviolent protesters, the whole works. And then after that, a lot of violence visited upon protesters who were arrested in King County Jail. But my role in that whole organizing effort and protest was with a few people. We undertook we learned one of the least popular activities in that protest organizing, which was to interact with the corporate media, to hold press conferences, to provide expert speakers, to ensure that while we expected the media to do a bad job covering the protests, we didn't want to think that it was our fault for not trying. So we did our best, and they did their worst, with the exception of independent journalists that came out. We launched a website called indiemedia.org, had an independent media center. This was '99, when the web was kind of just evolving into a very versatile and publicly accessible tool. So we posted text, photos, audio, video, and it really got a lot of global attention to the protest and to what was happening in Seattle. And that's where I met, in the Indie Media Center on 4th Street in Seattle, Amy Goodman, Jeremy Scahill, Juan Gonzalez, the whole crew from Democracy Now! That were there to cover the protest. And it was not long after that I was able to, it was in New York, and I started working with Democracy Now! I also, but in that time frame, was able to, I was recruited to organize a march in New York City on behalf of a political prisoner named Leonard Peltier, Native American activist with the American Indian Movement. He was imprisoned in 1975, and there's been a consistent global campaign to get his release. In 2000, there was a significant amount of energy directed towards appealing to President Bill Clinton for executive clemency. That effort failed. Many got clemency from Clinton, political donors, criminal counterparts to his half-brother, but no one, who had the support of Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, and so many others around the world, Leonard Peltier. So he's still in prison to this day. When I worked on that effort, interestingly, we organized the largest march ever held for Leonard in the end of 2000. 2 or 3 days later, another march was held to counter the one we held. And that was with active duty and retired FBI agents marching 2 by 2 back and forth in front of the White House. And one of Peltier's attorneys said at the time, it's the first armed march in front of the White House since 1814. And now we're all too familiar with armed protests wherever the president speaks. But it was then I went out to Lawrence, Kansas for about 6 months to help shore up the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee. The people who had been organizing for years were really burnt out, and so they needed a break, and I was available to help strategize and maintain the office, all the basic functions of a political campaign like that. So I spoke to Leonard every day on the phone, and I was able to meet with him weekly in the prison in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. And when I spoke to him on those weekday mornings, every day he'd call about 8 o'clock in the morning before he was being forced into one of the federal prison work camps, the Unicor furniture factory or other kind of wage slave labor that's forced on prisoners. Before he was sent off to do that, he would call and he would talk about what he had done between 7 and 8. They had a recreation period in the yard, and he would tell me that he and the brothers would gather around a small transistor radio and listen to Democracy Now! On KKFI community radio in Kansas City. And it was that hour of kind of undiluted, commercial-free global news that really set the tone for their day, their discussions, and all the toil and all the oppression that is visited upon prisoners in our system. It was really important. I know from discussions with Leonard and what he said about the others that this was an important source of information. And so it is, just as a reminder, those of us who have the freedom to come to wonderful places like the Alliance Center, when we support independent media, we're not just doing it for ourselves. There are people out there who are beyond the reach of our ever-weakened educational system, people who are locked up, people who can't access the internet, who don't have unlimited data plans or any device on which to access it. And so it's really important, I think, to support independent media for the broader good that it does in our society. And the evidence that I was shown so starkly is that these radio waves, when we support a station like KGNU, penetrate prison walls and reach people across any kind of class, race, age, or economic or educational barriers. It's so important. And that's just one example. And some of the evidence we have, like we got an email from a great community radio station in Sydney, Australia during the period that the Bush administration branded as shock and awe, when the mass slaughter of Baghdad civilians was happening with bombardment there. We got an email from a radio station in Sydney, Australia called Radio Skid Row. They forwarded a listener's comment. It said, "How is it that the poorest station in Sydney is providing the best coverage of the war?" And that was just a reminder. It isn't to fetishize penury or lack of resources, but the networks that are gathered on Spear Boulevard, for example, that are selling public airtime to dark money ad buyers to confuse voters and suppress the vote, and are making hundreds, they're going to make $900 million from the Koch brothers this year. Those people are doing a terrible job reporting the news. And it's through hard work of people like Amy Goodman, and we have a wonderful variety of a crew of journalists here in Colorado that are doing the work of the Colorado Independent at KGNU Radio. There's great work being done without all the glitz and high salaries that you get at some of the cloistered, walled-off networks that we have that have been empowered to profit from our public airwaves. We just recently got word from a prison system in the UK, in England. They emailed us about a year ago and said, "We have a closed-circuit TV system that serves a bunch of prisons. We'd like to put Democracy Now! On every day with your permission." And we're like, "You can absolutely do that. Like, no problem. You can." So they download the HD quality file every day, and anyone can do it. They put it on, and a year later, they've told us the results, and they said, the prisoners love the program. They've done some surveys, and they have metrics that demonstrate that the participation in their educational opportunities, these kind of elective classes that prisoners can go to with their free time or not, as opposed, with whatever kind of limited free time they have, the participation in those educational opportunities, classes, vocational work, has increased by 50% in the year, and they attribute that really specifically to Democracy Now!, and they wrote us a couple weeks ago to tell us that result. So this is just another example of how we can support independent media, not only for the value it brings to our personal lives, but also to the broader population, especially those who have such limited access to information. I want to thank the Alliance for Sustainable Colorado, John Powers, Jeff Hohensee, Brenna St. Onge, the whole crew here that have kind of been at the center of organizing this Truth in Media Coalition, a series of events. And I was really inspired and just humbled when they said that they were going to honor my colleague, Amy Goodman, as a hero of sustainability. I think it's a complex problem, climate change. How do we change our entire way of living? John Powers, who's here, says it so well, that we need truth in media. We need education to empower people to demand change. It's not going to come from the top down. It's going to come when people organize, and we need information to make that happen. And so that's, it's an honor for me, and I am, we'll be here later signing books or talking to any of you with or without a book. We're here until they, I would say until they shut the lights out, but the lights shut out automatically in this place, so it's really amazing. So yeah, get to know more about the Alliance Center and what goes on here. And I just want you to join me in welcoming a truly remarkable person and a courageous journalist and a true friend, Amy Goodman.
Thank you. Oh, it's been a long week. See, we're on a 100-city tour, and I think this is like city 16 or something. And when Dennis got the word that Democracy Now! Has worked for 20 years, that I was being honored for representing sustainability, I think he was a little confused, and he thought, sustainability, so nothing will sap her energy. So he set up this truly remarkable 100-city tour, and someone said to me, that's fantastic, 100 cities, so you're going to travel for a year? I said, a year? No, this is happening in like a month. And that's what we're doing, about 3 cities a day. Deeply committed to shoring up independent media. Because media is what will save us. I also want to thank Brenna, thank John Powers, thank the Alliance Center, how important this whole concept, but not only concept, putting sustainability into action. I feel like we are kindred centers. At Democracy Now! In New York, we also built our studios as totally sustainable, deeply believing that the medium is the message. We do our broadcast every morning at 8 New York time, which is 6 Colorado time, which is what we'll be doing tomorrow morning. So while Dennis was speaking, we were finishing booking the show for tomorrow morning. We're doing it from Denver Open Media. But it is such an enormous relief to come to Colorado because we just spent the week in California where the show broadcasts every morning at 5. And so crew time was 3. And our events usually last until midnight. Now, I was on Bill Maher on Friday night, and one of the other people was Ariana Huffington, the Queen of Sleep. You know, she's written a book called The Sleep Revolution. I offered to debate her on the merits of sleeplessness, because there's a lot you can get accomplished. She wasn't buying it. But at home in New York, we are committed in the broadcast every day to having students come, classes watch the show, kids who are in 4th grade, journalists from all over the world. Each week is a real happening as the show broadcasts. And we felt if they were coming to watch the show, to see the debates, it was also important that they were in a space that was sustainable, that they understood if we are really committed to this, we have to build that environment around us. It's not just talking, it's not just debating, it's doing. But speaking of debates, Dennis mentioned that every year we go to the UN Climate Summit. We went to Copenhagen and then to Cancun. We went to the Bolivia People's Summit in Cochabamba. The following year we went to Durban. We went to Doha after that. We went to Poland, the next year Peru, and this past year in Paris. And you might say, given what happens inside, why waste the fuel? Why did we go? We're the only national broadcast in the United States to be there every day for an hour, broadcasting exclusively what was happening at these summits. Well, maybe for years, not much got accomplished inside, but the thousands of people who came from around the world on the front lines of climate change, this was not theoretical for them. This was a matter of their survival. People from the Maldives, their country could soon be submerged. Africans from the sub-Saharan region of their continent, the desertification of Africa. This is a matter of life and death. And they would come to these summits, many of them not credentialed to be inside. And so we would be the bridge inside and out. And then you'd have those on the inside, on the outside, sometimes coming inside. And then you'd have them being thrown out if they dare to protest, you know, like the chair of Friends of the Earth International. It was just amazing to see. But that wouldn't stop them because of what this means. You know, the Pentagon fully understands the perils of climate change. They say it's the #1 issue challenging national security in the 21st century. When you think of, for example, the climate refugees, people desperately fleeing their homes because of climate-related issues. And so to give voice to all these people, in other parts of the world, they do debate climate change all the time, what we should do about it. But in the United States, the debate is about whether climate change is related to human activity. It is truly astounding that that's where we are, that we are so behind the rest of the world. It's as if every time we talked about planet Earth, we brought on someone from the Flat Earth Society for balance. Why? Why does this happen? Well, in the same way that money is drowning politics in this country. You know, as we're on this 100-city tour for the last week, 1,200 people were arrested in Washington, D.C., from Democracy Spring to this week, Democracy Awakening, saying, get money out of politics now. In the same way, that money is perverting the democratic process, making people believe that it is not one person, one vote in this country, perhaps one corporation, one vote. In the same way that people feel that way, the same thing happens in the media. Why are there these false debates? Well, you know, the media is brought to you by the very corporations that profit from climate change. So you have CNN, MSNBC, Fox, and how often these days you actually can't really tell the difference. I'm not talking about just between CNN and MSNBC, between the three of them. Because it doesn't matter which channel you're on. When you see Trump piped into your home 24 hours a day, you know, his words don't change on a particular channel. But only to be interrupted by these commercials every 5 or 6 minutes. Brought to you by the oil, the gas, the coal companies, the nuclear companies, the weapons manufacturers. And you wonder why there's very little debate on TV. I mean, I can't think of anything more unsustainable than war. How often do those elite Sunday talk shows on all the networks, as we're talking about Syria, as we're talking about Egypt, they will say, as we're talking about Libya, we'll be right back. This show brought to you by Boeing. We need a media that is independent. And that's what you have in Colorado with Free Speech TV, with Denver Open Media, with KGNU, with the radio station that Dennis is building in Winter Park, with the low-power FM station that he and Denver Open Media are involved with building here. There is so much hope. Yes, the corporate media has so fallen down on the job of bringing us truth in media, or the many truths. I don't even think it's about one truth. Hearing people describe their own experience is hearing the truths of different people's lives. We don't get that in the corporate media. What we get is this small circle of pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. Independent media is different. Now, I originally come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded, in 1949, the end of World War II, by a conscientious objector named Lou Hill, who came out of the detention camps in California and said there's got to be a media outlet not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. The first Pacifica station, KPFA in Berkeley. How many of you have heard of KPFA, the mothership of Pacifica, 1949? Not brought to you by corporations, as George Gerbner, the late dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania, would say, not brought to you by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell, that are raising our children today. The second station, KPFK in Los Angeles, 1959. My station in New York, WBAI, 1960. There's Washington, WPFW in DC, and there's KPFT in Houston. Now that's the station I want to talk about for a minute. KPFT went on the air in 1970 in the Petro Metro, Houston, Texas. They go on the air in the spring, and within weeks, they're blown up by the Ku Klux Klan. The only radio station in the country to be blown up. And it was right in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant. And I thought that was a good song. But the Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. They get back on their feet. I mean, the silver lining, it's not like Pacifica had money for advertising. And this certainly blew it into the consciousness of the potential listening audience of the people of Houston. They got back on their feet, and they went back on the air, rebuilt their transmitter, and the Klan blew it up again with 15 times the dynamite. So now it's taking a lot more time. They rebuild for a number of months, and in January of 1971, PBS comes into town. This is a national event. Arlo Guthrie comes back, and they put KPFT back on the air, and he finishes Alice's Restaurant. And they've been on the air ever since. Why would the Klan do this? Why do they even care? This little station in the middle of oil country. Well, I can't remember if it was the Exalted Cyclops or the Grand Dragon, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, dangerous independent media is, dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child, or an Israeli grandmother, whether it's an uncle in Afghanistan, an aunt in Iraq, whether it's a kid from the South Bronx or East St. Louis, or right here in Denver, it starts to challenge the stereotypes and the caricatures that fuel these hate groups. When you hear someone that you've never heard before, when you hear them describing their own experience, you start to understand where they're coming from. It makes it much less likely that you'll want to destroy them. I mean, it might sound like your bubba, your baby, your aunt, your uncle, and I'm not saying you agree with what they're saying. How often do we agree with our family members? But you begin to understand, and that understanding is the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it's wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take it back. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day. War and peace, life and death, and anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country. They can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us in civilian society to have the discussions that lead to the decisions about whether they live or die, whether they're sent to kill or be killed. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. On Earth Day, we're going to be in Colorado College in Colorado Springs doing a joint project with, I think, the Air Force Academy. The cadets are going to come over, and that's what I want to talk about with them. What it means to actually reason, think about, talk about war, weigh whether it's right or wrong. You know, about a year ago, we were coming through Denver, and the whole Democracy Now! Team. And when we came out, you know, that place at the airport where everyone, you know, holds up signs because they're waiting for their loved ones. So there was a group of soldiers who were holding up a sign for a general. It was a general's conference here. And so when we came out, they started waving, and I turned around, I thought there was a general behind me. We went off to get our luggage, and we came back and they started waving again. I said, oh my goodness. So I said, do you guys watch Democracy Now? Yes, ma'am. I said, really? How often do you? Every day, ma'am. And I said, really? Why do you watch? And they said, because you talk about war. It's not about for war or against war. It's about acknowledging what we are doing. There's no more serious decision a country can make than go to war, and if we're at war, as we are in an ever-expanding war around the globe, it has to be the top story every single day. And I just want to also say, Dennis is passing around the Daily Digest list, and this is key. This is about networking, communicating with each other. If you sign up, you get our daily headlines every day. And then you can decide, you know, who you want to know these stories and how important they are. Like you talk to people, I mean, I live in New York, so I don't have a picket fence at the back to talk to a neighbor, but it's like talking to your neighbor every day and saying, did you hear this and did you hear that? And by the way, if you'd rather not use the paper sign-up sheet, you can text the word Democracy Now! One word to 66866. 66866, and you'll get a request back for email. You put in your email, and then you'll get in your email a confirmation, request for confirmation. Also, if you're taking pictures or posting anything today, if you want to use the hashtag covering the movements, because that's what we do. We cover the movements, because it's movements that make history, it's movements that make the difference, it's movements that will determine what happens in this country. I mean, it's fascinating in this 2016 election year to cover the particular presidential candidates, and we do that every day. Of course, tomorrow, well, today is New York, and so we'll be covering the results of the primary tomorrow. But ultimately, even though that person who the country elects will occupy the most powerful position on earth, there is a force more powerful, and it is all of you and the demands you make of that person. And whoever that person is, whether you agree with them, the person you voted for was the one that was elected, or you fiercely disagree with them, you can't stop organizing and making demands. I mean, let's go back to 2008. Right, let's go back to the historic moment in November, Election Day, when this country elected the first African-American president in a land with a legacy of slavery. No matter what your position, that was historic. I do also think that the world heaved a sigh of relief on that day, because for so long people felt they had hit their heads against a brick wall. The wall became a door. The door opened a crack. But whether it would be kicked open or slammed shut was not up to that person in the White House. It's up to all of you. You know, when Barack Obama sits there in the White House and those who are used to having the ear of the most powerful person on earth, are whispering their demands. If he can't point out the window and say, if I do that, they will storm the Bastille. If there's no one out there, he's in big trouble. And that's when he agrees with you. What about when he disagrees? So what happened after President Obama was elected? I mean, think of all the movements that elected him. The immigrants' rights movement held out so much hope. The peace movement, I think it's the main reason he was elected, certainly as the Democratic presidential candidate. What was the main difference between him and Hillary Clinton? He was opposed to the Iraq War, and Hillary Clinton voted for the war. The environmental movement, of course. The gay and lesbian movement felt such optimism about President Obama. The racial and economic justice movements felt finally. And then he was elected. And I think a couple of things happened. First of all, you had the racist birther movement rearing its ugly head, led by none other than a current presidential candidate, actually the front runner of the Republican Party, Donald Trump. Right? What is the birther movement that said, he is not one of us? Look at him. He couldn't be from this country. I mean, did he say the same thing about John McCain, who in fact was born in Panama? No. But he said this about Barack Obama. How do you other people say they are the other? That's where the media comes in. It allows us to know each other, so it's much more difficult to marginalize someone. And I think part and parcel of this birther movement is what we see Donald Trump also representing today. It is no surprise. I mean, think about when he was asked whether he would disavow the support of David Duke. I can't remember if he was the exalted Cyclops or the Grand Dragon, but he was a Klan leader, right? And there is Donald Trump saying about Duke and the Klan, I'd have to, consider which particular Klan chapter was expressing their support. I mean, it's the first time you heard Donald Trump saying, I would have to consider something. But that he wouldn't absolutely disavow, that's part and parcel of the birther movement, of saying this person does not deserve to be recognized as an American. And I think that the groups that elected President Obama, the movements that held out so much hope, did not want to be a part of this racist backlash. And so even if they had criticism, they just didn't want to contribute to that. And so what happened, right? President Obama immediately said he would close Guantanamo. It's 7 years later, he hasn't. President Obama said immigrants' rights is critical. We see this amazing moment in the US Supreme Court this week when they are weighing whether President Obama's executive order on allowing people, immigrants, undocumented to stay in this country is being challenged. But sadly, it's President Obama who became the deporter-in-chief, dubbed so not by a group of radicals, but by the immigrants' rights establishment, many of whom have worked inside the White House and outside, who couldn't take it anymore, saying you've deported more immigrants than any president in US history. And then you've got the wars and the expansion, not the reducing of these wars or the scope of them, but the expansion. I mean, the fact that Afghanistan is the longest war in US history, and President Obama, not President Bush, has presided over this. Oh, Bush got it started. There is no question about culpability there. But what about ending it? So all of these movements who so deeply cared about these issues and felt that President Obama was the person, I think they didn't want to be part of the racist backlash, and I also think groups were tired. They could not believe what they accomplished in his election. It was absolutely momentous. And thought, well, now he can pick up the ball. But that's not ever how it works. As Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. Movements matter. My brother David and I wrote our first 3 books together. The first was called The Exception to the Rulers. That's what all the media should be, the exception to the rulers. The second called Static. The reason we called it that is even in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, still all we get is static. That veil of distortion and misrepresentations, half-truths and lies. That obscure reality, when what we need the media to give us is a dictionary definition of static. Criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. Dennis and I wrote 2 books. They're based on our columns. Dennis and I write a weekly column for King Features, which is owned by Hearst, to really provide a roadmap in the corporate media, newspapers and websites run this column, to independent voices, to this amazing universe or universes of, well, I think the vast majority of people, where you can find echoes of your own feelings and thoughts. And we wrote Breaking the Sound Barrier, and the final one, The Silenced Majority. And the reason we called it that is I really do think that those who care about war and peace, those who care about the growing inequality between rich and poor, and the rich and the rest of us, those who care about climate change, the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media. Think about how the media operates right now. We've been talking a lot about this. I was invited on CNN a couple of times in the last month to, interestingly enough, critique them. I was invited on Brian Stelter's show, Reliable Sources, about the media. He comes from the New York Times, and he said, so what do you think of us? The problem is, you don't, soundbite media, you get like 8 seconds. How much can you say? But let's look at one day, random, March 15th, Super Tuesday 3, I think the media dubbed it. So that day was 5 primaries: Ohio, Florida, North Carolina, Missouri, and Hillary Clinton's home state of Illinois. Let's look at the coverage that night. I mean, it just continued what has happened for the last year. Tyndall Report 2015, Bernie Sanders. Donald Trump gets 23 times the coverage of Bernie Sanders. ABC World News Tonight, 81 minutes for Donald Trump, 20 seconds for Bernie Sanders. I'm really curious what they found worthy to cover in 20 seconds in one whole year. So March 15th, these 5 states, and all the networks were doing their wall-to-wall coverage. So they played Marco Rubio's speech. That was the night he pulled out because he didn't win his home state of Florida. They played John Kasich's speech. That was the night he won his first and only primary, his home state of Ohio. They played Ted Cruz. They played Hillary Clinton. She gave her speech after her 3 wins that night, North Carolina, Florida, and Ohio. But it was too close to call in Missouri and Illinois. And she gave her speech after the 3, which was very smart because it's much better to, give a speech while you're ahead. And they played her speech as they should. And then they said, Donald Trump is about to give a speech, and they showed the empty podium in the corner, and they waited, and they waited. They said he was going to have a news conference in one of his mansions in Florida. You know what they mean by news conference. He sort of developed this, innovated this idea at the night of the primary, hold a news conference. At least that's what he called it, so that's what the media called it. Remember what he had done a few weeks before, an hour news conference where it was this kind of bizarre. He's trumpeting Trump water, Trump steaks, Trump magazines, and he's got everything laid out for you. And the media never cut away. You know, in the past, you sort of play what they're saying for a little while, then you move on to the next person. And interestingly, Hillary Clinton gave her speech that night. This was a few weeks before March 15th. They recorded it, and they saved it, and they played the entire sales pitch for an hour. And then they played Hillary Clinton's speech. Okay, back to March 15th. So we're waiting, and we're waiting. And they've got the little empty podium in the corner. And the pundits are, filling the airwaves, the pundits on all these networks who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. And then he gets up on the podium, doesn't do a news conference, speaks for half an hour, and that's it. But where was Bernie Sanders? So everyone spoke. They didn't even say, where is Bernie Sanders? They were just finishing up their coverage. They acknowledged that Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton were neck and neck in these two states, Missouri and Illinois, too close to call. I mean, had he gone to sleep, which would have made Ariana very happy, had he decided to take the evening off in this hotly contested night, not one of these networks even said, where is he? So the next morning on Democracy Now!, by the way, how many of you watch, listen to, or read Democracy Now!? Excellent. And I'm even happy about those who don't, because welcome to a new world. I can't wait till you tune in. And by the way, we have flyers that let you know all the places just right here in Denver where you can access Democracy Now! On public television, public radio, community radio, and of course at democracynow.org to send around to everyone. So the next morning on Democracy Now!, we played an excerpt of Bernie Sanders' speech. Oh my gosh, he had spoken. He spoke to thousands of people that night in Phoenix, Arizona. In fact, the proof is, I was just in Idaho Springs for lunch. We went up to support K-Goat, the mighty goat in Idaho Springs. And we went to Two Brothers Restaurant, and listeners all came out, and they were broadcasting the event, so then more and more people came in. And a woman in the corner said, I was at that speech in Phoenix. She said it was amazing, thousands of people were there. Really, so everyone else, they show it on TV, but you actually have to be in the place at the moment to know that Bernie Sanders has something to say. I mean, it's not about whether you support him or not. Who would have thunk it? The next morning on Democracy Now! We play an excerpt of his speech, that this is a revolutionary act to play a speech of a major party candidate the night or the morning after a major series of primaries. How can it be? There's nothing worse than, even if they attacked him, no news is, bad news, something like that for these candidates, but not to reference him at all, to vanish him, to white him out, there's nothing more damaging, which makes it even more amazing what he has accomplished, whether or not, he wins. What makes it more amazing that in March, he raised $44 million based on 369, which averaged $27. Hillary Clinton has to go off the campaign trail to raise her money in the private fundraisers, the most recent one with George and Amal Clooney in Laurel Canyon, where if you wanted the head table, you had to give $300,000 per couple, something like that. Even George Clooney, when asked about it on ABC, said, yeah, it was obscene. It was his party. And the problem for Hillary Clinton is that her donors are maxing out. And I mean, Bernie Sanders, when you're giving $3 and $6 and $9 and $27, you are not maxing out, and you can keep on giving. But what he has tapped into is movements that have been building for years. And that's the important issue here. And Hillary Clinton is certainly learning what people care about from these massive rallies. I mean, this is without an echo of what he's doing in the corporate media. Yes, he's getting some attention now because he's broken every single record from fundraising to mass rallies between the Democrats and the Republicans. And by the way, who would have thought that when I told you that story about the Klan in 1970 and KPFT being blown up, that today I would be referencing the Klan anything other than historically that people should know. On Democracy Now!, we are steeped in history, steeped in the history of movements. And in the corporate media, they say, especially young people, you'll lose all of them because they don't have that kind of attention span. I think they don't have attention spans for BS. I think that they have extremely long attention spans when it comes to serious, authentic voices, people at the heart of the story. One of the things we do on Democracy Now! Is we play speeches. From the beginning, when we were just on like 9 community radio stations in 1996, 20 years ago, you know, we were told over and over by stations that weren't running us, you know, you play these speeches, no one is interested, really. Well, we actually found the opposite, which is why I think, along with the authentic voices of people at the heart of movements, we broadcast then on 9 stations, and today we're broadcasting over 1,400 public television and radio stations around the country and around the world, with a station a week picking us up. We broadcast in South Africa, in Japan, all day in Sweden on television and radio. We perfected a way to send broadcast quality video through the internet. Throughout Latin America, our headlines are translated into Spanish, and just increasingly on PBS stations, NPR stations, community and college stations. The speeches, I just want to give an example of what they mean. If you're not doing 8 seconds or 9 seconds, and then they say, oh, the young people won't listen, how else do you present someone who thinks outside the box? If you only give those 8 seconds, you know, you say something like Saddam Hussein was like Hitler. That's like 4 seconds. I'm ready for prime time. They'll all have me on. Everyone knows every reference point in that. You don't need any more explanation. If you said something like, US administrations are guilty of war crimes. Actually, that takes the same amount of time. I'm ready to go, 4 seconds. But what am I talking about? I mean, what do you mean by war crimes? So then you have to explain yourself. And that takes explaining international conventions, the Geneva conventions. It takes explaining what war crimes are. And you're going way beyond those 8 seconds. And then they say it's not a political edit. You're just not quite there. You can't speak succinctly. No, you can't when you're not just repeating the conventional wisdom. Or is it really very wise? And so the more we play, to the astonishment of the establishment media, like a 40-minute speech, the more people tune in. I mean, we live in very dramatic times that are deeply consequential. And if we don't find another path, which comes from hearing how people who are innovative, creative thinkers and actors, we're not going to be able to dig ourselves out. But the fact is we can, because there are amazing movements all over the country and around the world. I started by talking about the UN Climate Summit. I wanted to go to one of them in Durban, South Africa. It was one of the first climate summits we'd covered. And, you know, people were getting arrested who got inside, who were supposed to stay outside, and the inside folks were making their deals, anything to have any kind of binding agreement that would sustain this planet. But then at the end, there was so much frustration that the inside invited the outside in. They invited a youth spokesperson to address the climate summit. And the person who addressed them was Anjali Appadurai. She was a student at College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine, where you get a degree in human ecology. And she led hundreds of young people into the UN Climate Summit at the end. And she addressed the crowd. She looked around, she took a deep breath, and she said, I speak for more than half the world's population. We are the silent majority. You've given us a seat in this hall, but our interests are not on the table. What does it take to get a stake in this game? Lobbyists, corporate influence, money? You've been negotiating all of my life. You've failed to meet pledges, you've missed targets, and you've broken promises, but you've heard this all before. We're in Africa, home to communities on the front line of climate change. The International Energy Agency tells us we have 5 years until the window to avoid irreversible climate change closes. The science tells us that we have 5 years maximum. You're saying, give us 10. She said, the starkest betrayal of your generation's responsibility to ours is that you call this ambition. Where is the courage in these rooms? Now is not the time for incremental action. In the long run, these will be seen as the defining moments of an era in which narrow self-interest prevailed over science, reason, and common compassion. There is real ambition in this room, but it's been dismissed as radical, deemed not politically possible. Stand with Africa. Long-term thinking is not radical. What's radical is to completely alter the planet's climate, to betray the future of my generation, and to condemn millions to death by climate change. What's radical is to write off the fact that change is within our reach. 2011 was the year in which the silent majority found their voice, the year when the bottom shook the top. 2011 was the year when the radical became reality, she said. And then she quoted Nelson Mandela, who said, it always seems impossible until it's done. So she looked around the room and ended by saying, so distinguished delegates and governments around the world, governments of the developed world, deep cuts now. Get it done. She walked off the stage, leading hundreds of young people out of the summit, and she rocked the world body. Even the president of the COP, that's the Conference of Parties, what the UN Climate Summit is called, said after Anjali and the young people left, on a purely personal note, I wonder why we let not speak half the world's population first in this conference, but only last. And so the next year, when we were in Doha at the UN Climate Summit, I saw Anjali from a distance outside, and I went up to her and I said, oh, will you be coming into the conference? And she said, no, I've been banned. Okay, so there was major protest, and she eventually got in. But think about what she said, these movements, especially talking about 2011, the year that the bottom rocked the top. And I want to end by talking about that year as a year of movements and the kind of impact they have had on us even today, 2011. I want to start at the end of 2010. That was the Tunisian revolution, right? You had this young man named Mohamed Bouazizi who was so frustrated in Tunisia. He came out of university, no opportunity. He starts to sell fruit and vegetables in a marketplace. The authorities take his scales and he can't take it anymore, and he sets himself on fire. That's the spark of the Tunisian revolution. And there was something else. There was WikiLeaks, right? Julian Assange and WikiLeaks released all those documents, the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, and the State Department cables. And those cables showed in the case of Tunisia, I mean, it's not like the people of Tunisia didn't know their despot was corrupt. They've been always saying that. But they then understood that the US understood it as well, but that the US was shoring up that despot to the tune of millions of dollars. It just angered them further. And then the Tunisian revolution sparked the Egyptian revolution, and you know what happened there. I mean, that is a revolution, to say the least, that is not completed. And it's taken a horrific turn in Egypt right now. But what they accomplished then, one of our producers, Sharif Abdel-Quddus, you with us for 8 years, Egyptian American from an illustrious Egyptian family. His grandfather, one of the most famous writers of Egypt, Hassan Abdel-Quddus. We were at Sundance. We always cover the documentary film track at Sundance. When he was looking at his phone, he was getting texts, he was getting photos, family and friends saying, I will die for my country. And he's saying, I will die for Egypt? Are they kidding? This is a different place. I have to go home and see what's happening. And he raced home and he landed in Tahrir, followed quickly by Hani Massoud, one of our amazing videographers who leaps tall buildings in a single bound, who you want at your side when you're covering difficult situation. He was like even on the Egyptian national basketball team. He too, Egyptian American, and they did not leave Tahrir. They brought you the revolution, not the bird's eye view of the million people, which was impressive. I'm sure all of you remember that. But the people themselves fomenting revolution. Because when you see that bird's eye view, which we also showed on Democracy Now!, it's intimidating. It's, well, how did that happen? It has nothing to do with us. But when you meet the people who are waging a revolution, so Sharif would go around, he'd be interviewing people, and Hani would be filming. And you met Adef Sawef, the great Egyptian writer who wrote Map of Love, who was with 2 9-month pregnant women who said, we will not give birth until Mubarak falls. We want our babies to be born in freedom. You met Nawal Saadawi, the 79-year-old psychiatrist, presidential candidate, author of so many books. She'd been imprisoned and exiled under Nasser and Mubarak. And before Tahrir, she was holding salons telling young people, we will win, we will win. And you met the young high school student who had this broadsheet that she and her high school friends had produced, standing in front of the state media building that had spewed lies for so many decades, putting out their newspaper, Voices of Tahrir. These were the people. They could have been your family, your friends, your organizations. And that's what's astounding. When you have a grassroots media, you start to identify. Then thugs had taken down the satellites. So you had even the networks looking like an old-time Democracy Now! You know, Anderson Cooper you see through a fuzzy Skype in the lower third, as he's reporting, says, broadcasting from an undisclosed location. It was his hotel room. But there was Sharif in the middle of Tahrir, saying where he was, saying it was the safest place to be. And you were meeting and realizing what Nelson Mandela said. It always seems impossible until it's done. And we didn't rely on satellites. We couldn't afford it, though we use satellites sometime now. So we had perfected this way to send the broadcast quality video through the internet. Hani would race back to Sharif's house and he would put together the 25-minute reports, and you would meet the makers and shakers of the revolution. And I do think that Egypt, among other things, inspired Wisconsin. Well, I mean, Governor Walker did too, right, by trying to bust the unions, and the people rose up. Wisconsin, this was in the winter of 2011, the largest protest Wisconsin had ever seen. 150,000 people marching in the freezing cold. And of course, we raced to Wisconsin. They were occupying the state capitol. They were sleeping in the state capitol. And I saw some of the biggest guys I'd ever seen in my life, the Oshkosh prison guards. And I went up to them and I said, who did you vote for? You know, who did you vote for? And they said, Governor Walker, of course. And I said, so what are you doing here? Protesting Governor Walker, of course. They said, he didn't say he was going to do this. Now, what Walker said is he was going after the teachers' unions and the nurses' unions. But he assured the firefighters and the police that he wouldn't touch them. But Walker had a problem, because the firefighters and the police were married to the teachers and the nurses. And they also understood, you know, when you say, don't worry, I'm not going after you, I'm going after them. That first, they'll come after them. But then, if no one speaks up, they're going to come after you. And so they were all there. I mean, I'm a New Yorker. I never saw anything like this. In front of Governor Walker's office, you had kids with dreads down their back, drumming on anything they could find, and the police rocking out next to them. No, it's not New York, that is for sure. And then outside, the 150,000 people, you had, I saw this older guy, white hair, glasses, marching in the snow with a placard. It said, IRS auditors against Walker. So I went up to him and I said, are you a Democrat or a Republican? He said, I'm a Republican, of course. So I said, but didn't you elect Governor Walker? And he said, yes, but I don't agree with him now. I said, well, you have a mighty powerful weapon there, IRS auditors against Walker. And then I went up on the crane and I saw the vast vista of people. And I saw across the Capitol grounds the State Labor Museum. And if anyone says to you, I mean, what really happened there? You know, it fizzled out. Governor Walker was reelected. You know, these movements just die. If they say that to you, I think you should think again. I mean, every movement makes a difference, and you don't know how it will grow, what road it will take, when it will be submerged, when it will rear its head again. I mean, look at Wisconsin. You have this state that was home to the John Birch Society, right? That John Birch Society was founded by Charles and David Koch's father, co-founded by Fred Koch. That racist, segregationist organization that took on the civil rights movement, went after Dr. King. So that's Wisconsin. But you also have Wisconsin as the birthplace in 1932 of AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. Now, when Dr. King was assassinated, April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, what was he doing there? He was standing with sanitation workers who were simply trying to organize a local of AFSCME. Did Dr. King make a difference? Of course. And it just shows how profound it is when people stand up, even if it takes decades, what it means. And then jump forward to the summer of 2011. At the White House, the massive protests against the Keystone XL. Right, you had the ring around the Rose Garden, 1,200 people got arrested, including the great Naomi Klein. It was her first arrest. Naomi, who wrote the great books, I encourage you to read every one of them, No Logo and The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. Her latest is called This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. You've got, Bill McKibben, who founded 350.org. They're all getting arrested. And then a few weeks later, September 17th, 2011, thousands of people stream into Zuccotti Park, right? This is the beginning of Occupy Wall Street. Thousands. The media completely ignores them at first. I mean, we live in the media metropolis in the world in New York, and they just walked by them. Nothing worse. But they built their encampment. They carried every sign imaginable. And finally, I mean, the media could not ignore them for that long, and they started to cover them. I should say ridicule them. I remember when Erin Burnett first went on CNN, her first broadcast had a segment on Occupy. It was called Seriously? And this is how the media dealt with it. My God, they'd say, I mean, every issue under the sun, you got the people against the death penalty, you got the people against war, you got the people for the environment, you got the people for racial and economic justice. Oh my God, they were listening. That's right. They were enumerating all of the issues that people represented, and that wasn't its weakness, that was its strength. Linking all of those issues. And then they said, I mean, they can't even choose their own leaders, you know. Well, it was a leaderful movement, or it is one. It was not a leaderless movement. And so we move forward a few days from Occupy. Democracy Now! Raced down to Georgia on September 21st. That was the day Troy Anthony Davis was slated to die. A number of the placards that people carried at Occupy said, I am Troy Davis. Too much doubt. I am Troy Davis. Who is Troy Davis? He's about 40 years old, served half his life on death row. He was arrested when he was 18 years old. And I wanted to share this story because this story against the death penalty, this story around the death penalty is a story against death that refuses to die. I won't go into all the details of his case, Troy Davis's case, but suffice it to say that by the time of the fourth death warrant was issued, 3 had already been vacated. Troy had the support of not just traditional anti-death penalty activists, but of prosecutors, prison wardens, a former US president, and the Pope. So we did not know what would happen on September 21st when we went down. We just knew we would not turn our cameras off. Would this death warrant be vacated, or would the state murder this man? We came onto the prison grounds, and this is how it works, and if you want to know how the corporate media works, we got to the grounds, and the prison guards were allowing 150 people to protest within a roped-in penned area, and it was the human rights leaders, NAACP, Amnesty International, it was the family of Troy Davis. His remarkable older sister, Martina Correa, I can't say enough about this woman, who was a Persian Gulf Army nurse, came back, was fighting for her own life. She was dying of breast cancer. Her face adorned every Savannah mammogram van as she had tried to encourage black women and poor women to get mammograms to save their lives. Oh, she was honored as a leading light with Nancy Pelosi in Washington. But she was on a mission, not just to save her own life, but to save the life of her brother. And she was part of a movement, leading the movement against the death penalty. She, at this point, and I had interviewed her many times before, was in a wheelchair in the center of this protest pen. And then 1,000 people were across the street because they weren't allowed on the prison grounds. The students from Morehouse and Spelman holding candles, calling for the life of Troy Anthony Davis to be spared. So that day, we got, oh, I want to say one more thing before I describe what happened that day, because it involves Colorado and a wonderful independent newspaper here. This is about the death drugs and why the death penalty is becoming increasingly rare in the United States. In an effort to stop the death machine, anti-death penalty activists have been choking off its lifeblood, the killing drugs. Hospira, the last US-based company to make sodium thiopental, one of the 3 drugs used in the lethal cocktail administered in most executions in this country, quit making the controlled drug, creating a national shortage. States began scrambling to keep their death chambers well stocked. When California borrowed a similar drug from Arizona, its Undersecretary of Corrections and Rehabilitation, Scott Kernan, wrote in an email, "You guys in Arizona are lifesavers." An expose by Katie Fretland and a Colorado Independent reported that Assistant Oklahoma Attorney General Seth Branham joked in an email with a Texas colleague in 2011 that he might be able to help Texas get the drugs in exchange for 50-yard line tickets for a top college football game between the University of Oklahoma and the University of Texas. Branham went on to propose in an email that Oklahoma officials, who he dubbed Team pentobarbital, be rewarded with an on-field presentation of a commemorative plaque at halftime recognizing Oklahoma's ongoing contributions to propping up the Texas system of capital punishment. That was written in an email. But let me go back to the day that Troy Anthony Davis was scheduled to die. We went to the prison grounds. There were all the people who were protesting. And the prison guards gave us the press packet, the Department of Corrections. It talked about the schedule of Troy Davis that day. He would be able to see family until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then they would clear out the family so he could get a routine physical. Routine physical? Well, what happened in Texas a little while before that is a Texas man on death row had attempted suicide. They raced him to the hospital, they got him better, and then they executed him. So he had to get a routine physical to make sure he was fit enough to die. Then the next part of the press packet went into detail into what Troy would be given for dinner that night. He had already said no to, that last supper where you choose whatever you want to eat. So they said this is the standard fare that he would be offered. Grilled cheeseburgers, oven-browned potatoes, baked beans, coleslaw, cookies, and a grape beverage. Another page listed the lethal cocktail that would follow. Pentobarbital, pancuronium bromide, potassium chloride, and Ativan, a sedative. The pentobarbital anesthetizes, the pancuronium bromide paralyzes, and the potassium chloride stops the heart. Troy Davis refused the sedative and the Last Supper. At 7 p.m., oh, I should say we started broadcasting at 6. We really didn't know what would happen, and we had rented a satellite truck to broadcast whatever we could. If we could have been inside the execution chamber, we would have. I really do think if you get to see the images, if you know what's happening, you can make a much more responsible decision, especially when it comes to national policy. I mean, we live in a globalized world, yet it's so hard to get information in this country, especially when it comes to where we stand in the rest of the world. Few people realize how rare we are in the industrialized world in imposing the death penalty. So, we went to the grounds of the prison. Our satellite truck was late. You know, it's the one that serves CNN, that's rented by Fox, and we were incredibly annoyed. Like, we wanted to start broadcasting. All the other satellite vans were lined up. The prison guards wouldn't let them come near the protesters. We went, well, what are you talking about? We have to be there. I'm not going to just broadcast for 6 hours and speak myself. But you know, how long were they going to be speaking? Those vans, they didn't protest. The reporters that were there, they're going to, what, speak for 60 or 20 seconds? That's not what our plan was. Finally, our satellite truck pulled up, and they came on the grounds, and they rolled down their window, and they said, Miss Goodman, where do you want the van? I said, well, the guards are saying, no, where do you want the van? So I said, well, I would like it right over there next to the protest pen, and they barreled this satellite truck over to the protest pen. And then these guys got out. They're the satellite operators, they're the videographers who we had hired, didn't know them, from Atlanta. And they were bigger than the Oshkosh prison guards. And the prison guards who came over to them backed off. And then they came out, they took out their cameras, sort of redefined what it means to shoot a scene, huge cameras. And they handed me the microphone, and they formed a kind of semicircle around me of protection, and they said, start broadcasting. And we did, at 6 o'clock, not knowing what this night would bring. By 7 p.m., the U.S. Supreme Court was reportedly reviewing Davis's plea for a stay. The case was referred to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who hails from Pinpoint, Georgia, a community founded by freed slaves that's near Savannah, where Davis had lived. The Supreme Court denied the plea. Davis's execution began at 10:53 p.m. A prison spokesperson delivered the news to the reporters outside. Time of death, 11:08 p.m. Though eyewitnesses to the execution stepped out. The way an execution works in this country, if the person is going to be given a lethal injection, is they're laid out on a kind of Christ-like cross. Their legs strapped, their arms strapped down, and right before they're injected with a lethal cocktail, the curtains are pulled back on a window in the death chamber for the audience to see. The audience consists of the murder victim's family members, the people the prisoner chooses, if the prison allows them, and reporters. So the eyewitnesses to the execution stepped out. According to an Associated Press reporter who was there, these were Troy Davis's final words. He was convicted of killing an off-duty police officer, by the way, named Mark McPhail. Mark McPhail was a hero cop. He was moonlighting at a Greyhound station. A homeless man was being pistol whipped, and he went out to save him, and he had hardly come out, had not drawn his gun, when he was shot in the head and the heart. The problem was, Troy Davis, from the beginning, said he was not involved with his killing. The man whom most of the witnesses pointed the finger at, named Red Coles, who they said pistol whipped the homeless man and shot the officer. Red Coles had left immediately from the scene, got a lawyer, went to the police station, and fingered Troy Davis. So, Troy, laying on the gurney, with his arms strapped down, said, "I'd like to address the MacPhail family. Let you know I'm not the one who killed your son, your father, your brother. I am innocent. I did not have a gun. All I can ask is that you look deeper into this case so that you really can finally see the truth. I ask my family and friends to continue to fight this fight." And then he turned to his executioners and said, "For those about to take my life, God have mercy on your souls. May God bless your souls." The state of Georgia took Troy Davis's body to Atlanta for an autopsy, charging his family for the transportation. On Troy Davis's death certificate, the cause of death is listed simply as homicide. As I stood on the grounds of the prison just after Troy was executed, the Georgia Department of Corrections threatened to pull the plug on our broadcast. The show was over. I was reminded of what Mahatma Gandhi reportedly answered when asked what he thought of Western civilization. He said, "I think it would be a good idea." These stories must be told. They go beyond the death penalty. They go to the issue of who is put in prison, the issue of mass incarceration, the issue that the Black Lives Matter movement has raised in interrupting all the presidential campaign candidates, changing the conversation, just as Occupy did. 2011, the word most commonly used, according to the dictionary, was Occupy. Everyone knows what the 1% is, and the 99%, you know what is being referred to because of that movement. When you change the language, you change the world. I wanted to end where I began, talking about the beginnings of Pacifica Radio in World War II, and go back to Germany, to a young brother and sister named Hans and Sophie Scholl. They weren't Jewish, they were German Christians. And they thought, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? And together with their professor and other students and workers, they formed something called the White Rose Collective. And they decided that they would simply get out information. And so they published a series of 6 pamphlets. And on one of those pamphlets, across the top, it said, "We will not be silent." They had these distributed in the middle of the night everywhere. They would have them dropped in marketplaces and alleyways and schoolyards. Well, Hans and Sophie and their professor were captured by the Gestapo. They were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today, should be the Hippocratic oath of us all today. We will not be silent. Democracy Now!